This is our last session today, and it sort of continues the issue of historic roots of development. Excuse me.
Your seats there.
Yeah. Yeah. But this time focusing perhaps more on trust and cooperation. And it is with pleasure that I introduce Timur Kuran, who is professor of economics and political science at Duke University in the United States. He publishes his work in English and Turkish, and we are very pleased to have him here in Russia. And without further ado, I yield the floor.
Thank you very much for the invitation. This is my second time in Russia. In fact, second time at the HSC in less than a year. I was here thanks to Andrei Yakovlev at a conference this past summer, which was extremely productive, a very impressive conference. I thought that we had a great time at the university and the Civic. So, the voluntary exchange process is central to human civilization, and it happens to depend critically on trust. Suppose my house needs to be repainted, I am able to hire a paint crew to do the job because the paint crew trusts me to pay them for their work. You can think of me in this Edgeworth box as A and the paint crew as B. The workers also know that if I don't pay, the courts will force me to do this. If at the end of the work I give the crew a check, the workers trust that the banking system will honor the piece of paper. They also trust that the money that the check represents will hold its value. So two distinct forms of trust simplify and even enable the exchange process. There's interpersonal trust, like the trust between me and the paint crew, and there's trust in impersonal institutions. So crews trust in courts, in the banking system, in money, as examples. And that is not all that trust does. Members of the paint crew trust that their company will pay them for their work. They will, of course, be turning over the check to their company. They trust that the company won't just keep all of it. They will pay them for their work. I trust that the paint company will use safe, unleaded paint. I trust that if the work is unsatisfactory and I complain to the paint company, they'll send somebody to inspect, and if a shoddy job was done, they'll redo it. I trust that if a painter has an accident in my home because of my negligence, my insurance company will provide compensation, and I could just keep adding to this list. In the absence of trust, transaction costs would be prohibitively high and markets would not function. Now, if this seems obvious, it's because a generation of social scientists have now supplied the empirical and theoretical foundations. This was news to most economists, however, in 1972 when Kenneth Arrow wrote in a Philosophy of Public Affairs article, it can plausibly be argued that much of the economic backwardness in the world can be explained by the lack of mutual confidence. But since the 1970s, huge and very diverse literatures have emerged that link trust to economic performance. They tell us that capital flows out of low trust regions and to high trust regions where transaction costs are low. High trust regions tend to have lower corruption, better governance, better contract enforcement, and they tend, partly as a result of all these things, to be richer. The studies tend to measure interpersonal trust through the World Values Survey question. Generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted, or that you can't be too careful in dealing with people? Using this question in cross-country work is problematic because an exact translation is impossible. Nevertheless, the global index based on this question, by and large, validates Arrow's intuition. The low scores that we see here in the score of Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean, Russia, the Middle East, all stand out. And these are places we associate with low trust. The OECD is relatively high. A surprise here is that in China, trust in strangers is remarkably high. And I just learned through a conversation just a few minutes ago with Christian that is in fact due to a different understanding of the question on the part of the Chinese. And if you're a little more careful about what you mean by strangers, you get more realistic answers. There's also an index measuring, instead of interpersonal trust in institutions. The country coverage here is more limited than the World Values Survey. Most of Africa is missing. Much of the Middle East is missing. At this level of aggregation, it's hard to make sense of many of the figures. We don't yet have studies, as far as I know, of how various components of this index, trust in government, trust in media, etc. These are what you see in this on the screen here. It's just a weighted average of trust in government, business, media, and NGOs. Perhaps looking at the less aggregated figures will one can link them to growth in a useful way. I'm pointing out this table simply to give a sense of research opportunities. Fortunately, the work on the role of trust in economic development is not dependent on survey questions alone. There are other ways of quantifying trust. I'm going to provide some of the highlights with a focus on the Middle East, which is a very low trust region. For the purposes of this talk, the Middle East consists of the entire Arab world, plus Iran and Turkey. In other words, the historical core of the Islamic world, which was under Islamic law until the start of the 20th century, or was governed under Islamic law until the early 20th century. Then I'm going to turn to the question of why trust is so low in the Middle East, and I'll take about 20 minutes or so suggesting several historical mechanisms that account for the Middle East's trust deficit. Then I will move on to policy implications. These are meant to have generality, and I'll draw on mechanisms here. I'll draw on some mechanisms observed in other regions of the world. The Middle East is, of course, not the only low-trust regions. Other low-trust regions of the world may also benefit from the policy implications that I'm going to draw. Some of the policies that I'm going to suggest are appropriate to the Middle East, may do some good in other parts of the world as well. Finally, I will relate the implications that I identify to the evolution since World War II of the conventional wisdom in the field of development economics. And I'm going to suggest that we are in the process of entering yet another phase and conventional wisdom on what is needed, what is keeping certain regions chronically underdeveloped. This is undergoing some refinement yet again. So as I said, the evidence that the Middle East is a low trust region goes beyond answers to World Value Survey questions. Trust and trustworthiness are measurable through laboratory experiments alternative. An excellent example is a paper by Bonnet, Herman, and Zeckhauser. They conduct trust games on subject pools assembled in 3 Arab Gulf countries, Kuwait, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates, and 2 Western countries, Switzerland and the United States. This is a game in which a principal can divide a pot of money between himself and an agent. Okay, and if he does the division himself, they share equally. Alternative, he can assign the task to the agent, in which case the agent can divide between the two equally with a substantial premium, so there will be a substantial gain for the two. But there's a risk for the principal in that the agent can decide to choose an outcome which would be even better for the agent at the expense of the principal. In other words, in this game, to trust is to take a risk. The person you trust may prove himself untrustworthy. So do Arabs play the game any differently than the Swiss and the Americans? Indeed, Arab principles require a greater probability that the agent will prove trustworthy. And the reason is that in the Arab world, the cost of betrayal is quite high. The institutions to which one can turn for help in response to breach of contract are weak. This decreases trust outside of social networks. In effect, Emiratis, Kuwaitis, and Omanis require greater levels of trustworthiness relative to the Swiss and the Americans before they will trust. And how do they obtain that trust? They obtain that trust by getting to know you. The Swiss and the Americans are substantially less averse to betrayal because they come from societies where contract breakers can be forced to pay damages. Through experiments conducted in Cairo, Binzel and Fair, in a paper written several years ago, find further evidence that a low trust equilibrium in the Arab world that inhibits profitable exchanges. They use a within subject design that involves having Cairene subjects play a variant of the trust game that we saw. This is a binary trust game, but with a hidden action that's been tacked on. The principal's choice is the same. As you can see, the principal can either distrust the agent and make the division himself, okay, or trust the agent to do this, in which again the agent can either prove trustworthy and betray. The added part of this game is this part here. There's a non-trivial probability that the principal will still get the low payoff, okay? Will still get the low payoff of 4 that he would have gotten in case he betrayed, okay? And this is an action, this is a chance action that is not under the control of either the agent or the principal. So even if what makes this game interesting is that even if the agent does cooperate, okay, from the standpoint of the principal, what the principal gets may actually be no different than if the principal, than if the agent had betrayed. So
If the principal gets the low payoff for it, the principal decides to trust the agent and then gets the low payoff, the principal cannot tell whether it is because the agent betrayed him or because the hidden action produced an unlucky outcome. Okay. Now, this experiment produces two findings relevant here. First, the principals exhibit higher trust when they play with friends than when they play with strangers. And this is something that the experimenters control. Second, people systematically underestimate the trustworthiness of agents. A substantial share of the plays end up with inefficient outcomes because of unrealistically low trust, both in friends and in strangers. Again, the implication is that profitable trades fail to materialize, in this case in Cairo, in Egyptian society, because of low trust. Now, before the emergence of experimental evidence, economic anthropologists were reaching the same conclusion. The same conclusion that the Middle East, and in particular the Arab world, particularly extreme form the Arab world, Arab countries form a low trust region. The method of economic anthropologists involves close observation and thick description, in this case of how business gets done and of how people interact with each other and how people interact with organizations. In a high trust society like Finland, to get something from, let us say, a state agency, typically you look for the appropriate procedures, try to find out what forms you need to fill out, what office you need to go, where the closest office is, and so on. Try to find out what the formalities are. Then you follow the procedures that you've found out, and you get the service that you seek. Okay? In Cairo, instead, you identify an insider who can pull strings. Insider at the organization who can pull strings. If you don't know of an insider in the organization, then you first identify somebody who is likely to know somebody in that organization. You ask that person to put you in touch with the insider, or for your contact to take over. You delegate the work to the contact who gets in touch with the insider and gets you access to the service. In a low trust society like Egypt, who you know matters critically. For a building permit or for help with a neighborhood traffic problem, you don't pursue your rights as a tax-paying citizen. You seek someone with influence. This is not to say that there are no procedures in place. There are organizations that have procedures, but you're much less likely to follow them. In getting a friend to help you out, you turn your relationship with the state agency, which is an impersonal organization that you don't trust, into personal exchange between people who do trust each other. Some insider connected to you does you a favor. You reciprocate by doing a favor for him or her. Now, the favor could be a bribe. Often it's not. You might help the insider who helps you with this particular state agency. You might help that insider's nephew get a job in your company. Okay. This is when the nephew needs a job, they get in touch with you as an insider, and you figure out how to place the nephew in the company. Likewise, to get a private company honor its warranty, you don't expect in a low trust society to place a call to the company and then obtain a replacement in the mail. You find an insider in the company who will follow through. In dealing with a company, as in dealing with the state, you use personal connections to make the company bureaucracy meet its contractual obligation. Now, these patterns have been known to anthropologists for a long time. Now, there's an MIT working paper that I came to become familiar with at a conference I went to just before coming here last weekend. It was a conference at Stanford where this paper was presented. This presents experimental evidence from Baghdad. The authors show that search procedures on matters involving getting service from a state organization or from a private organization, it depends on various factors, including whether you are part of the city's Shia majority or its Sunni minority. It's a very clever design. They give every subject a phone, a prepaid phone. They take their phone when they come to the experiment, and in 2 hours they give them a different phone where they can use the phone to check the web about procedures. They can call their contacts. And the nice thing about this is at the end of 2 hours, they collect these phones, and the experimenters can see exactly what during those 2 hours, exactly what searches took place. Whether people were looking for procedures, whether people were looking for personal contacts. And probably won't surprise you that people go straight to their acquaintances and try to find insiders. Another interesting part of this, another interesting result is that the circle that the Shia majority, members of the Shia majority use, tend to be narrower than those of the Sunni minority, and the authors attribute this to the Sunnis in Baghdad having been a minority there for many, many centuries. They say the experience of being a minority forced them, in order to get work done, to develop work within circles that do include members of the Shia majority, whereas the Shia were never forced to do this. But everyone, as economic anthropologists have been telling through observation, now they've been able to show, they've been able to quantify that people rely overwhelmingly on personal connections and that they don't follow the procedures. Now, the personalism of exchange in the Middle East, in contexts where exchange is now largely impersonal in developed societies, is a source of economic underdevelopment. It shifts rewards to people with connections and certain social skills that create private benefits but not wealth. It also dampens the rewards of hard work and creativity. It reduces organizational efficiency. This is a lot of people in organizations are spending time doing favors for friends. Within the organization, even within the organization, if you need to get something done with higher ups, again, you don't follow procedures, you try to go through personal connections. This makes the economies of the Middle East, or is among the factors that makes the economies of the Middle East less efficient than those with which they compete globally. The personalism of exchange in the region is also a source of political instability. In weakening the rule of law in favor of the wealthy, it reduces the legitimacy of the political system. The system that relies on connections is going to benefit disproportionately people with good connections, and they tend to be educated, wealthy, people, members of certain privileged groups like the military and the high bureaucracy. Now, one should not jump to the conclusion that this is a permanent feature of the Middle East. After all, exchange has not always been predominantly impersonal in societies that are now economically developed. A millennium ago, personal exchange was the norm everywhere. People did business primarily with acquaintances, primarily with members of the religious ethnic group, members of the neighborhood, and so on. Trust in strangers was very limited. Interregional trade was carried out only by certain networks that specialized in creating trust among network members. The fostering of trust on a broader scale, trust in organizations, and trust in government is a later development. It's something that took place in Europe and European settled lands in the course of the second millennium. The impersonal exchange is among the products of the economic modernization process. In the late Middle Ages, that process began in certain parts of Western Europe. It then spread first to the rest of Western Europe and to places settled predominantly by Europeans, such as the United States, Canada, and Australia. The Middle East is among the laggards in regard to economic modernization. It's only in the 19th century that this region began the transformation that took many centuries elsewhere. Some parts of the region, such as the Arabian Peninsula, started the process that began 1,000 years ago in England and Holland only in the 1930s. And there are pockets in the Middle East where the process started even later, in the 1950s. Now, given this immense delay, the region has actually come a long way in just a few generations. Nevertheless, in regard to the exchange process, it remains in transition between medieval economic life and modern economic life. Its patterns of trust and business procedures involve a mixture of modern institutions, such as state agencies, specialized state agencies, and private corporations, which now exist all across the region. So you have these modern institutions on the one hand, banks also, which are impersonal or financial organizations. So on the one hand, you have these modern organizations, and then you have medieval practices using personal exchange instead of following impersonal procedures. So why is trust low in the Middle East? There are historical reasons. The pre-industrial economic institutions of the Middle East were well suited to environments in which economic interactions occur almost exclusively among people who have reasons to trust each other. But those same institutions prevented the development of generalized trust. Trust in strangers, in organizations, in government, from developing in the Middle East, and especially in the Arab world. Some traditional institutions went even further in that they incentivized people to break contract. Okay, they incentivized low trustworthiness, which then led to low trust. Okay, a society consisting of untrustworthy, relatively untrustworthy people, you trust relatively less. So I'm going to discuss three mechanisms in turn. These have to do with the scale of organizations in the private economy, the biases of Islamic law, and the weakness of civil society in the Middle East. And then I'll end, as I said earlier, I will then draw some general policy implications that transcend the specific case in hand, in other words, the specific case of the Middle East. But I'm going to make the case that low trust equilibria are rooted in history in large regions of the world with reference to the Middle East. So in the medieval Middle East, as in medieval Europe, individuals pooled resources to finance and operate trade ventures and production operations through partnerships. Partnerships were temporary enterprises formed by individuals who trusted each other, though courts were available as a last resort when people had disputes they couldn't resolve among themselves. An investor, for example, financed a long-distance trader's trip from, let's say, Baghdad to Damascus. When the trip was over, the profits were shared, the enterprise ceased to exist. Partnerships were small in membership, most had no more than 2 members, and they were ephemeral. They had no legal existence apart from the membership. If some member of a partnership died or was simply incapacitated, the partnership was null and void. In the 19th century, indigenous enterprises in the Middle East were still operating as they did a millennium earlier. There were no permanent for-profit enterprises in the Middle East as late as the middle of the 19th century. There were no business corporations, no companies with a legal standing apart from the individuals who financed the company and did the work. In the intervening millennium, Europe generated a joint stock company and a business corporation. European merchants, investors, customers, and suppliers all grew accustomed gradually to dealing with large enterprises and permanent organizations. Organizations that could outlast the individuals or the individuals founding them. Meanwhile, the legal system in Europe developed to accommodate organizations alongside individuals as legal parties. So trust in organizations and government developed in tandem. And this happened organically and gradually over many centuries. Now, why institutional development in Europe and the Middle East diverged is a question that fascinates me. And I've addressed this in a series of articles and books. I can discuss the specific mechanisms to why Europe, organizations in Europe evolved, they became more complex, they grew in scale, and why this didn't happen in the Middle East. I can do this in Q&A if there is interest. The key point here is that in the Middle East, it was not until the late 19th century, or in some parts of the 20th century, that the business corporation, the modern profit-making company, or what we call in economics, we call the firm, is entered domestic legal systems. It was not until then that you could sue a domestic company in an indigenous court. Until then, you could sue individuals. You had courts going back to the Middle Ages where you could sue individuals, but not the company that they represented. You could not sue the government. You could sue an individual government employee, but not the government. Even the courts treated exchanges involving companies as personal deals. An exchange involving one partnership and another was always, as far as the court was concerned, a transaction between 2 individuals. Okay. You could sue an individual clerk who mistreated you, never accompanied. When the legal reforms were made, when a law of corporations was put in place in Turkey in 1908, in Egypt shortly thereafter, and eventually everywhere else, resistance was minimal. The corporation was accepted without much fuss. Trust in corporations, that's something else. Peoples of the region are still learning to trust corporations. Courts are still learning to separate corporate interests from personal interests. The fact that the courts were not ready for corporations reduced the efficiency gains. The political problems caused by delayed development, including colonization, complicated matters further. But the central point is that the region is still learning to deal with impersonal exchange. The glass is still half empty because the region still just recently started pouring water into a glass that Europe started pouring water 1,000 years ago. So here's the timeline that may be useful. I want to draw your attention to the fact that in Europe, the early corporations emerge essentially at the time that Islamic law is developing. This is the period in the 7th century through about the 9th, 10th century. This is the time when Islamic law develops. Nothing happens then, at least in this world, nothing fundamentally, no institutional developments take place that would lead in the direction, lead from personal exchange toward impersonal exchange. The big changes occur in late 19th century and early 1900s with the adoption of laws of corporations. Okay. Now, so the Middle East has been undergoing the transformations in terms of economic life since 1900 to the present that Europe did in all this period. Europe had early corporations in years already in 800. By the year 900, 4,000 cities in Europe were chartered as corporations and incorporated themselves. Thousands of monasteries incorporated themselves. By 1100, the Roman Church declared itself a corporation. You had mega companies with at least 100 employees, many of them with at least 100 employees and at least 100 shareholders by 1300. And by 1600, you had the first business corporations. These were the global trading companies, the East India Company, the Dutch East Indies Company, and so on. So you can see this is where it's the countries that have this history that have much higher trust in strangers as well as in organizations. The Middle East was a laggard, and so this timeline indicates some of the difficulties we're facing. So let me turn now to a second historical cause of low trust in the region. And this has to do with the procedures of Islamic law, in other words, of the Sharia. Until a century ago, in the Middle East, commercial and financial contracts were enforced through Islamic courts. And these courts followed procedures that were substantially and measurably biased in favor of three groups. First of all, they were biased in favor of elites with friends in high places, because judges were appointed and dismissed at will by the Sultan. In trials pitting elites against commoners, judges tilted verdicts in favor of elites. This doesn't mean that elites always won. If commoners had sufficiently strong evidence, then they could win. But if the evidence was fairly equal, the benefit of the doubt always went to elites. The Islamic courts were biased, secondly, in favor of men. Judges and their staffs were exclusively male, so they saw cases through male eyes. Male witnesses were preferred because the judicial system considered them more credible. And all the judges and court staffs learned in the course of their training, their judicial training, that men are more credible, they have better memories and so on. In cases pitting a man against a woman, male testimony was treated as relatively more credible. So both men and women tended to favor male witnesses for this reason. Female witnesses sometimes did testify, sometimes they were the only ones who had witnessed a certain event, but people preferred male witnesses. And the courts were biased, thirdly, in favor of Muslims and against non-Muslims, which in the Middle East meant Christians and Jews. It's important to remember that prior to industrialization, the share of non-Muslims in a Middle Eastern city, or in a Balkan city, could be 20, 30, 40%, sometimes more in major commercial centers. The courts were biased in favor of Muslims, partly because the court staffs consisted exclusively of Muslims. After all, these were Islamic courts. But also because non-Muslims were not allowed under Islamic law to testify against Muslims. Muslims could testify against non-Muslims, but the reverse was not the case. A non-Muslim could only testify against another non-Muslim. There was no restriction on the testimony of Muslims. So why does all this matter? It had huge implications for trust and trustworthiness. The biases in favor of elites, men and Muslims, meant that if members of these groups broke a contract and you had to sue them in court, your chances of getting restitution were compromised. If you lent, say, to a male Muslim, your chances of getting the courts to force repayment were lower than if you lent to a female Christian. And there's more to it, precisely because the courts were less likely to enforce the contract, the male Muslim borrower had a greater incentive to default. So male Muslims were relatively untrusted, and they were, in fact, relatively untrustworthy. This did not mean that legally privileged groups could not borrow. It meant that they paid a huge premium for credit. In work I've just completed with Jared Rubin, we found that on the eve of industrialization in Istanbul, the 17th and 18th centuries, privileged groups, and the privileged groups here are males, Muslims, and elites. The average real interest rate was around 19%. You could see relative to that males paid a premium, Muslims paid a premium, and elites paid a huge premium. And the premium amounted to about 20-30% of the cost of credit. Okay, so it is quite substantial. Now, as the modern global economy took shape and credit became increasingly critical to economic success, the patterns you see here turned into a huge handicap for Muslims. In sectors where raising capital was important to success, so mass manufacturing, mass transport, for example, these are sectors where you need a lot of capital, and chances are you wouldn't have it yourself. You would want to borrow. Muslims found that they could not in these sectors compete with local non-Muslims, but also compete with Europeans. They fell behind in capital accumulation, they fell behind in developing business skills. Of course, if you don't go into business because you can't borrow, you also don't acquire the business skills. If you can't get jobs in business, you're more likely to get jobs in the government. The elites are going to feel that they have to provide jobs for the Muslim minority. So what you find is that the bureaucracy becomes increasingly Islamicized and the commercial sector becomes increasingly de-Islamicized, which was not the case in the Middle Ages. And of course, you have trouble establishing a business reputation. If you do somehow, at some point, get some capital, it's you enter the business without a reputation, and you're competing with people who have it. Now, the Islamic courts that created this pattern are gone practically everywhere. They play a limited role in a few places, such as Saudi Arabia. Of course, the Islamic State has restored these courts in Syria and Iraq, where it's been able to, but the effect of historical patterns on trust and trustworthiness today endures. Interpersonal trust is low in the region, partly because of its legal history. Groups that were untrusted in the past are relatively untrusted today. In places where you still have substantial numbers of Christians, including Syria and Egypt, Muslims will tell you that they prefer dealing with as partners, as customers, as suppliers, that they prefer dealing with Christians to Muslims because of this trust factor. Now, until now, this is something, by the way, I've been aware of this. Many people, I've heard this from many people in various parts of the region for many years, but I had absolutely no reason to. I had no reason to accept it as true until this work, and this work that I just showed you some data from, actually now provided a mechanism that would explain the origins, the historical origins of this relative difference, relative cross-religious difference in, or sectarian difference in trust and trustworthiness. So I didn't, in my book on why the Middle East fell behind economically, I did not include this, which was at the time anecdotal, but now there's a reason to actually conduct a systematic survey to test this eventually of historical approach. Another institutional pattern common to the Middle East is weak civil society. Civil society refers to the collectivity of associations that people form outside the family, the state, and the commercial sector to advance common interests. It has played vital roles in every successful democratization process. The checks and balances that are essential to democracy come partly from private associations that put up resistance when their interests are threatened. These associations help to block authoritarian tendencies that exist in every government, everywhere in the world. They also build trust because people feel protected by the private associations that they foster, and that, of course, contributes to growth. Now, it's often observed that Middle Eastern monarchs and presidents emasculate the news media. It's observed that they suppress intellectual inquiry, they restrict artistic expression, ban political parties, co-opt regional, ethnic, and religious organizations. These authoritarian policies, it is said, account for the weakness of civil society and by implication for low trust. But causality goes both ways here. Rulers can pursue oppressive policies, and they can do this for decades on end because civil society is so weak. In the Middle East, the modern political and economic institutions were superimposed on a pre-industrial institutional complex that was poorly suited to democratization. A key element of that traditional complex was the Islamic trust known as the Waqf. Practically, traditionally, when I say traditionally, this is before Westernization started in the 19th century, practically all social services were provided through Waqfs, not by local governments, which was the pattern in Western Europe going back all the way to the Middle Ages. This difference had enormous consequences down to the present. In Europe, local governance promoted democratization by equipping people with the skills to organize, to make their wishes known, and to hold officials accountable. If a mayor doesn't clean the streets, you can boot the mayor out at the first opportunity. Okay. In the Middle East, the Waqf limited democratization by keeping these kinds of skills undeveloped. It also limited the development of civil society. Waqfs controlled a lot of resources for the benefit of various groups, but the use of these resources were set by the founders, who might have been dead for several centuries. The managers of Waqfs did not have to pay attention to the preferences of the beneficiaries. They had to simply follow the rules in the Waqf charter. That limited political participation. The beneficiaries did not participate in the decision of how the assets of the Waqfs would be used. Waqfs could not pool resources with other entities, so they formed no durable political coalitions. In Europe, you got coalitions among various local governments, among various cities. This did not happen in the Middle East. And these Waqfs limited political participation further by denying their beneficiaries a say in the selection of officers. Okay. So each officer just appointed his own successor, and this limited trust in organizations providing social services. Now, in the modern Middle East, local governments in cities, this would be municipalities, they've taken over functions once performed by Waqfs. Nevertheless, the effects of the Waqfs are still with us. The earliest municipalities, the earliest local governments in the region go back to 1850. The weakness of civil society, which rulers in the Middle East have exploited, stems in part from the lack of organizational skills on the part of individuals, the absence of a custom of accountability, and the lack of a tradition of forming private political coalitions to pursue shared causes. Now, I've tried to convince you that the reasons for low trust in the Middle East are very deep. That means, unfortunately, that there are no quick fixes. Promoting private organizations, getting regimes to relax their restrictions on private society will help. But boosting trust will be a slow process, even in places that are more or less at peace. And it's practically hopeless in places like Syria, which are currently the scene of bloody civil wars. Where rule of law is missing, it can be, in principle, imposed by outsiders, assuming that outsiders are willing to bear the cost. A foreign power can impose on an undeveloped society its own laws or a new set of laws, and if necessary can do so through foreign experts. This happened in certain places when Europeans formed colonial empires. French governors, bureaucrats, soldiers, and judges helped to maintain rule of law in French colonies. After World War I, The French imposed laws on Syria, the British imposed rules and laws on Iraq. French and British legal experts did some of the work. With trust, outsiders have much less leverage than they do with rule of law. If members of society don't trust each other as individuals, you can't make them do so easily or quickly. This is something that they have to learn through experience. That said, rule of law can help. It can create the conditions under which trust develops. But again, it's bound to be a slow process. Having given you a pessimistic assessment, let me suggest finally, and I will end there, that there are ways out, even if the results will take time. The existence of high-trust societies offers proof that transformations are possible. And one can learn from their experiences and apply them to low-trust societies. Historically, there have essentially been two paths from a low-trust environment to a high-trust one. One of these relies primarily on politics, and the other on economics. And the two pathways are, of course, mutually complementary, and the two pathways, in fact, operated together and supported each other in practice in the case of Europe. So the first pathway is one that relies on the development of civic life. The classic argument was made by Bob Putnam in Making Democracy Work. The empirical setting for Putnam's book is Italy, where government in the north is much more efficient than government in the south. The north is also substantially richer, and it's a place where generalized trust is relatively higher. Decades of efforts to close the gap and reforms have repeatedly failed. Formal institutions, the laws and the system of governance are similar in the north and the south. The two regions of Italy have the same democratic system and same election rules. What differs is the informal institutions, the customs, the norms, the habits, the attitudes, all things that cannot be legislated. And these include various forms of trust. And the differences in levels of trust mean that the same formal institutions yield different results, much less satisfactory results in the south than the north. A measurable difference between southern and northern Italy is that civic life is substantially more lively in the north as measured by participation in civic associations. In the south, participation is hampered by mistrust among individuals, mistrust in government, and mistrust in organizations. In its various forms, trust is inadequate, and that is a key reason why resource transfers over many decades from north to south have not closed the interregional gap. Government regulations and the democratic system that make northern Italy prosperous yield poor results in southern Italy. Trust cannot be established by northerners or by other outsiders, and it cannot emerge overnight. But an environment conducive to establishing sustained private associations will generate more of them. People will learn to become more comfortable with such associations. They will trust them more as they derive more benefits from them. The effects of trust take a long time to materialize, but historical experiences suggest that they do develop. The second policy tool involves trade, and I will end with this. At least since Adam Smith, economics has promoted the idea that trade promotes the efficient use of resources. That's essentially what is depicted through this Edgeworth box. Much less emphasized today is the contributions of trade to the characteristics of the traders. that trade, the very exchange process changes the characters of the people doing the trading. I mentioned that you need trust for trade to take place. If any trade is to take place, if you're to move from E1 to E2, you need some trust. Early economists, including some of Adam Smith's predecessors, pointed also to the opposite causal relationship. When people trade successfully, they contribute to the trust needed to facilitate further trade among them. So there's a virtuous circle at play. Trust promotes trade, and trade promotes trust. Albert Hirschman wrote about this virtuous circle in a superb book called The Passions and the Interest. He documents there that the great thinkers of the 17th and 18th centuries promoted trade less because of the allocational benefits than because of the political consequences. Trade tames people's destructive impulses, they said. It makes people more trustworthy, makes people update their expectations and trust potential trading partners more. Soumitra Jha makes an analogous point through an empirical analysis of modern India. The specific question in this Jibo paper is why in Gujarat ethnic violence is more common, substantially more common in some places than others. In a nutshell, the explanation is that in places where ethnic groups traded with one another, these were old trade towns, where the population included Hindus and Muslims, they show more tolerance today. There is less inter-ethnic mistrust, there's less rioting. The essence of the argument is that of Hirschman. Jha points out that in towns characterized by trade, the ethnic groups had complementary skills, and the complementarities are treated as given, but also widely recognized. I would suggest that complementarities are not always noticed, let alone put to good use. Given the aging populations of today's economically advanced countries, they have a lot to gain from young immigrant populations, but the complementarities get much less attention than the social risks of immigration. In other words, complementarities are not always self-evident. Someone has to notice them, and that's not enough. Someone has to then defend them. Leadership is required. There are going to be vested interests, and they have to be countered. Groups that emphasize that jobs lost must be countered with information about the social gains, including the net effects on social trust and social peace. Perhaps the goal should be to look for complementarities between different groups, to exploit this pathway to increase trust, the trade path. We need to look for the complementarities between different groups. Trust can be boosted by making sustained efforts to identify and disseminate information about complementarities among groups that are currently suspicious of one another, groups that treat each other as opponents rather than as potential collaborators. Doing this will ultimately serve the purpose of increasing trust, but again, I'd like to re-emphasize that this is likely to be a slow building of trust. It's likely to be a slow process. Thank you very much. I'm very happy. I've been very happy.
Thank you very much, Timur. We do have some time for questions and answers. Because this session sort of transcends the boundaries of our lab event, I don't know everyone in the audience, and on the other hand, this session is recorded and translated, so I would ask each person who asks the question to please identify himself or herself before she asks the question. So, please.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. My name is Chris Welzel. I'm a member of the LCSR located at a university in northern Germany. I have two questions. One is, I wonder if what you describe a little bit as, one could say, like Islamic exceptionalism. I wonder if this is not a more common pattern that we would also find in other major pristine civilizations like China or India, and that Northwestern Europe is actually the exception. So this is just one question. The other one is, I don't know how aware you are of how much this complements or corresponds with differences in family law. Going back to the British anthropologist Heinau, who came up with this particular pattern of family formation that he found in the medieval ages pretty early, and it was only found in Northwestern Europe, and it consisted of a couple of factors. Marriage was consensual rather than prearranged. Households formed already before the Industrial Revolution. There was a focus on nuclear families rather than the extended family. The third issue was neo-locality. When a couple married, they founded their own unit, their own household, rather than moving into the household of some parents. There's a fantastic book by Mary S. Hartman, The Household and the Making of Family, where this Heinau thesis is investigated and strongly confirmed. And what she shows is that early on in Northwestern Europe, for instance, household services, taking care of elderly people, was decoupled from the kinship relation. So parents would send out boys and girls at the age of 14, 15 to other households to help them. And this was on a contractual basis. After 4 or 5 years, they would leave with savings, with equipment, and have the stuff together to marry and settle down. So the argument would be that the consensus principle was already in the core societal unit, the family, the household, and from there it could spread in a more contractarian, so contract was the thing, and that means interaction with strangers. Whereas in the other civilizations, we find cousin marriages, and we find the bonding, the kinship, penetrating, not being concentrated on the private sphere, but penetrating the public sphere as well. And I think this complements very well to this, because you look more at courts, at the status of corporate law and this kind of thing, but I think there's more complementarities that make the picture more complete.
Thank you.
So, to start with the first one, I think it was a famous Russian novelist that said that every unhappy family has a different reason to be unhappy. I'm probably paraphrasing it, making a mess of it, and paraphrasing it, but anyway, that sticks in my mind. So, again, there are many low-trust societies, and there are some common mechanisms, and the one that you mentioned might be one of the central ones that account for the fact that they remain low-trust societies and not made the transition as Europe did. Europe rejected nuclear family, established on the basis of consensual marriage. I think that's common. They also have some different, there are different mechanisms that all led to, however, to the same outcomes. For example, there are different legal systems that all prevented in the Middle East, in India, in China, that prevented the emergence of corporations, the modern firm. And so there are different ways that you can block the pathway to the modern firm. So I don't think that the Middle East is exceptional. I think you're absolutely right that Europe is the exception in that it got from a low trust equilibrium to a high trust equilibrium through an internal evolution. This was self-generated. All these other places, they are, however, shortening the process through many institutional transplants. So trust, even in a place like the Middle East, or take the most extreme case, the least developed parts
of the Arab world, trust is much greater now than it was a century and a half ago. Even in a place like Iraq, the circles that people use are much broader than they were in the past. So societies like the Middle East, Russia to an extent, China, Latin America, they're all in the transition. I don't think it needs to take, given the European advantage, borrowings from Europe, it does not have to take, and of course new technologies we have today, it does not have to take a millennium here. There are other examples, but of course there are unique characteristics in each of these cases as well. In the second case, I think you've put your finger on a very important mechanism that explains why Europe did put itself on a different path. I would like to suggest that we have evidence in comparisons across civilizations, across regions of the world, in the rate of cousin marriage. There is a consanguinity index that you can find on the web. And one of the amazing things is, I think cousin marriage is in Scandinavia something like 1%. It amazed me to see that it was even that high in Scandinavia. It reaches the highest rate of something like 27% in the most tribal parts of the Arab world, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, even the places that have become wealthy. These, I think probably the consanguinity index, I haven't done this, someone would probably track the interpersonal, maybe somebody else has already done this, and would track it.
On a side note, this is where Japan is similar to Western Europe.
Yeah.
We have at least more than three questions. Do you mind if we do it in a bunch, like three at a time?
That's fine, and I should be much more brief
So,
to the answers.
in the first bunch, the three questions are Peter Mayots, LCSR, Vladimir Gilbertson, and Dmitry Kutin. So, Peter.
Thank you for your really interesting thought-provoking presentation. The only trouble I have that you basically treated people, to my mind, as laboratory rats, which respond to punishments and rewards. And all this institutional story, however amusing it is, I think really leaves out one important piece, which is systems of meanings, that is to say, culture. Nowhere you recount culture figures, and we know at least one story, of course, Max Weber's story of Protestant ethic, that basically said that transcendental, the belief system is cause of trust, and we can go down to this, to Islamic culture. I don't know much, a lot about Islamic culture and their treatment of strangers, or their treatment of games, by the way. Maybe they treat gay experience, by the way, differently from the Westerners. So that a point of concern for me. Thank you.
Vladimir Gilbertson.
Vladimir Gilbertson from the HSC. Well, I first should join others saying that thank you for excellent presentation. I'm thinking about two other strands of economics literature, recent literature. that looks at the evolution of trust and determinants of trust. One line I'm thinking of, this is Alicina's papers about family ties and how family ties and the evolution of family affected evolution of trust. And the second line, this is Aguillon and others' papers about distrust and regulation. Less distrust generates higher demand for regulation, more regulation affects, and we have reversion. So basically, all these strands of the literature, they say in the nutshell the same thing, that less trust leads to underdevelopment. Yeah? But I'm thinking how they cross up. That's one thing, one question. And the second question is, if there are so different mechanisms, but all work in the same direction, does it mean that there is a kind of trap which is almost impossible to quit? And those high trust societies, they have handicap which probably will never be exploited.
And Timur Kuran is International Institute of Sociology and LCSR.
I would like to link your presentation, your research, with a more profound issue of randomness and regularity of cultural patterns. So, regarding trust, do you treat it as a phenomenon in itself, meaning that it's just in some cultures it is the way it is and in others another? Then how to explain regularities in distribution of levels of trust that is not kind of random according to some pattern? And if you treat trust as caused by more fundamental factors, then what is the ultimate cause? Taking the example of Italy, you said that prosperity is linked to trust. Well, trust can be linked, traced to differences in civic life intensity or trade. Then how did it emerge in itself, right? Is it due to different levels of urbanization? Then Northern Italy was urbanized, but earlier Southern Italy was more urbanized, like in times of Rome and when it was colonized. If you link it to international trade, that Northern Italy is more trading. Then earlier, Southern Italy was more immersed in trade with Arabic countries, and only later, due to change of trade routes, Northern Italy became involved in those European networks. Or do you see other causes, or is distribution of trust random and unpredictable? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, why don't I go in the opposite order, starting with Dimitri's question. So, I do not treat any of my work, or I'm not making that assumption here, that cultures are fixed. Analytically, as scholars, we have no choice but to start at a particular point in time. And at that point in time, we have to take certain institutions as given. Okay. No matter how far we go back, something we're going to take as given. Then we have to do comparing societies, look at the set of institutions in one place and the set of beliefs that you start with, and see whether they are self-enforcing or perhaps even self-reinforcing, in which case it just perpetuates itself in the absence of an outside shock. Okay. And then you carry it forward, and if you don't have an outside shock, there's no change. A major outside shock can cause a change. So that's one possibility. That is what we had in the Middle East. We had fluid institutions up until about the 10th century when the Sharia was developing. It developed, and then you had mutually reinforcing institutions, and that equilibrium, which included low trust, did not get upset until there was a huge shock from abroad. And that shock from abroad was the rise of Europe and the colonization and the existential challenge that Europe posed
opposed to the region. That's what broke the equilibrium in response, and the occupations and colonization brought various institutions, and places that were not colonized, like Turkey and Iran, felt so threatened that they founded various institutions, and a new process started. So that can happen. Alternatively, in a particular place, the bundle of institutions and beliefs can form a self-undermining equilibrium. That the equilibrium leads to innovations, creates incentives for innovations, which then perhaps upsets some other balance and generates new innovations. And this is the pattern we observe in Europe over the second millennium, that every new innovation generated incentives for other innovations, and beliefs changed in them. So I think that this is the methodology that I feel comfortable with, and it doesn't require treating any culture as fixed. In fact, I would be the first to acknowledge that business culture in the Middle East has changed enormously over the past century and a half. But it's starting from a very low base in terms of trust, and still has a way to go. Now, Vladimir's point, I think that you do make a very interesting point, which is that you can have, just as you have that trade can be part of a virtuous circle, regulation and government interference can become part of a vicious circle. That the regulation and government interference reduces the amount of trades that individuals have to undertake themselves, which then reduces one of the sources of trust in society. So if you started at a high trust, like you can diminish that reservoir. And there are people, today there are people, there's past scholars like Albert Hirschman, Adam Smith himself, others who would argue that in putting constraints on trade, in turning over certain allocation problems to government bureaucrats as opposed to the market, we have to be very careful, because we're diminishing the amount of trade, the interpersonal trade that takes place, which will affect trust. So thank you for bringing that up, and that's something that needs to be included. Finally, Peter's question of systems of meanings. I completely agree that this is part of it. In fact, the very last slide goes in that direction. I argue that Jah's argument, which takes the complementarity of skills between Muslims and Hindus as given, is missing something important. Because you can give those complementarities, those relations between Hindus and Muslims, you can assign different meanings to that. You can treat the Hindus and Muslims as rivals. You can look at their relationships from a theological perspective. You can look at the advantages they get from trading with each other, the mutual gains that they derive from that. That doesn't happen automatically. What I'm suggesting here is that there is in fact a layer of meaning that you have to attach to, that gets attached to the complementarities. Those meanings may enhance the complementarities in people's minds, may make people recognize those complementarities, they may also do the opposite. They may make people seeing the same relations notice not complementarities, not a potential for mutual gain, but instead mutually or relations that are destructive to one side or another. So this is, no, I absolutely agree with you that, that meanings are part of it, and they're part of, if we look at the evolution of societies, the evolution of civilizations, they evolve as institutions evolve, and belief systems support institutions, or they fight with them.
Thank you. Technically, we are almost running out of time, but if the speaker kindly agrees to take maybe 3 more.
Absolutely.
So
As many as
3.
you want.
3? Well, there are more than 3, and I'm hard pressed to choose.
Maybe
But-
take them all and I will just give brief
Okay,
answers.
let's take all of them. Then, Timur, please identify yourself.
Yeah, my name is Vibhu Prasad Naik. I work for Data Institute of Social Sciences in Hyderabad, in India. Thank you for this interesting presentation. I would like to point out the complementaries which you have discussed here, again in the context of the jihad example. That's a wonderful example. So the complementaries might have created some trust within the community.
Between Muslims and
Yes.
Muslims and Indians.
Yeah, between the community. But the same community, when they interact with the government, they exhibit a different level of trust. And they may trust among, Hindu and Muslims may trust each other, but they may not trust the government.
Thank you. Philippus, Exodus, I don't remember from where.
As a researcher in the University of Reading in UK. You have thank you for the presentation. You have mentioned 2 practical advices regarding how to boost trust. One of them was the civic pathway to build more, establish more associations, I guess. And the second one was to enhance trade. And you have also mentioned both of these reasons as reasons of low trust. So it seems that we're going back to the reasons in order to boost trust.
Thank you. Nina Tsonkova.
Hello, thank you for your very interesting presentation. I'm PhD at the University of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. I was very fascinated by your talk about weak personal ties and how that impedes development of social trust. I could see how the other direction could function as well, that actually social trust, low social trust impacts impersonal relationships. Is there any way out of this vicious circle? Thank you.
Yeah. That gentleman behind you. Sorry.
I
Please,
see your point.
please identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Dinesh Garg. I'm an assistant professor at the Economics School, Moscow. So I know this is a difficult question, but when you started talking about the divergence between Europe going back to the 10th and 11th century and the Islamic society being stuck in there, so why do you think that happens? So Eric Cheney has a piece on that, and he explains that based on the military shocks and the strength of landed and the bargaining power of landed aristocracy versus the slave armies in the Islamic society. So what's your take on that? And maybe you could elaborate on why and when it happened in Europe.
Thank you. Then Francesco Saracino, Scott at Luxembourg, and LCSR.
Thank you. Very briefly, 30 years of time series indicate that trust in others is not crystallized. Actually, it changes a lot across countries. Sometimes it grows, sometimes it goes down. Moreover, we know that trust does not converge across countries, and we know that trends of trust do not depend on initial level of trust. So this tends to suggest that if there are some historical roots on differences of trust across countries, well, one explanation does not fit all. I think on this we could agree. Moreover, still 30 years of time series indicate that trends of trust are negatively affected by economic growth when this is accompanied by increasing inequality. So I would be very cautious when concluding that trade can be a way to enhance trust, because there is also another literature, I'm here referring to Olson or Polanyi, for instance, which suggests that actually growth can be a source of erosion of trust. Thank you.
Is that Valentina Rotondi?
Yes.
I don't see very well in these glasses, sorry.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm Valentina Rotondi from Politecnico di Milano. And so my question is more tied with the relationship between particularized trust and generalized trust. It seems to me, given your presentation, given what I wrote, that actually in the Middle East and in several other parts of the world, particularized trust is more generalized than generalized trust. So the question is, and is a big question now in economics, in sociology, and several other social sciences, how to change particularized trust into generalized trust as a way to spur development. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, I guess Roberto Foa, I guess Harvard University.
Hello. Okay, great. Well, my question will be extremely brief because Francesco got a little bit ahead of me. So since the World Value Survey started in 1981, actually there have been some big shifts over time, which implies that some of these trust equilibria might not be as stable as we think. So, both the Netherlands and the UK both had about 45% social trust in 1981. But since then, the UK has dropped by 15 to 20 percentage points, while the Netherlands has increased by 15 to 20 percentage points. So there's a huge gap between them now that just wasn't there at the start. And that's in 30 years, so we don't know what it looked like 100 years ago. So I have a practical question, which is I really loved the data that you showed on historical implied credit default risk using interest rates. So based on your knowledge of this data, do you think, would it be possible to conceive of creating a data set of comparative historical data set of social trust using the credit default risk data?
Thank you very much.
To start with the last one, it would be a dream come true for me if we could do that. As it turns out, with regard to interest rates, there is a massive amount of work looking at the rates at which governments borrowed. And of course, this provided information on the creditworthiness of governments. But studies looking at differences across individuals are very hard to find. The only study that I'm aware of has to do with Holland. And in Holland, it turns out and it was done for exactly the same period that we covered in our study. A group of economic historians at Utrecht did this study, and what they find is that the relationship was flat for all of these, and they basically asked the same question for the religious minority, you're talking about Catholics and Protestants, of course, but again, they look at men and women and elites and so on, it's essentially flat. In the modern world, we have interest rates are much lower for the wealthy and the privileged than the poor. In the United States, the average short-term interest rates for the wealthy have been 15% over the past 10, 15 years. For the poor, it's about 400% who have to borrow from pawn shops. So we've gone from a situation where the wealthy, privileged people paid more for credit to one in the modern world where they pay much, much less for credit. Holland, it turns out, in the 16th, 17th century was in transition, going from where a relationship where the wealthy paid more, because the reason is that their courts were becoming fairer toward all groups. The biases that existed in the courts of Istanbul, they were overcome. Okay. So unfortunately, we do not have
information on for other countries. My hope is that with the results that we've produced, will generate an interest in looking at interest rate data in places from Japan to England. Surprisingly, for all the work that has been done on England, for all the data that's available, nobody's looked at this. And the United States will actually come up with information, and then we'll be able to compare trust across societies using these interest rate differences as a proxy for trust. We have gone beyond the time. We want me to just very quickly say something, or some of them I'll just take as a comment. I will take Bibu's point just as a comment that people don't trust government. Again, as one of the indices I showed, it's trust in government can be different from trust in private organizations and so on. So this is obviously there can be variations across societies, variations across time in these things. Personal, low social trust impeding impersonal relationships, absolutely. Absolutely, this is something that, and how do we prevent this? It's one way to do it is interactions with outsiders. When outsiders come in and locals see that outsiders benefit from dealings with organizations, it gives them the idea that maybe there is something to dealing with foreign organizations that already have a reputation is another way. And then you have local organizations that imitate them. Gunesh's question about the causes of the underdevelopment of the Middle East is something that if I had time I could continue to speak tomorrow. By tomorrow this time, it's a big question. I think that the inability of the region to develop large impersonal organizations and flexible organizations in the private sector, and the fact that all public goods were provided through very inflexible organizations, I think were the main factors. You referred to Cheney's explanation. I think Cheney's explanation is largely a special case of this. He talks about, he and his co-author Blades, they talk about the slave military. Those slaves, within a generation, they became quite wealthy. They put their wealth in waqfs, and enormous wealth accumulated within waqfs. So it's very much a part of this, part of the general explanation and idea. But unfortunately, I don't have more time to elaborate. But I'd be happy to tell you about that. If I've forgotten anything, as I have a note here that as trust increases, trends of trust don't depend on whose question was this? Anyway, I will. There's one other I can't. Trust. That trust is not yet. There were a couple of people who made the point that trust is not the. Absolutely, there are factors. There are going to be fluctuations that are affected by other factors. Trust can diminish during recessions when people who would normally honor contracts will less likely to honor them.